Okay, so we're going to talk now about some issues about clinical interviewing and common questions that I get from students pretty much in every class that I've taught. So I wanted to start with the issue of confidentiality and transparency, right? I think when you're working particularly with younger children, um, I think we have to keep in mind that children live sometimes, not every time, but sometimes they live within a family structure for children that live with family members, whether they are parents or another primary caregiver. But just children and adolescents live in a certain type of structure, right? They don't necessarily make decisions on their own, and I don't want that to be misinterpreted. I think in an ideal world, parents and caregivers would respect the right of a child and an adolescent to choose what they want. But the reality is, in many of our societies, children and adolescents are bounded and guided by what their family establishes as the basic rules and norms for living within that family, right? So confidentiality becomes very hard, particularly when you're working with younger children. With adolescents, it's a little bit more flexible, particularly because they're in an age that as as they age within adolescence, they have better decision making skills, and they're in a better position to decide what is right for them or not, versus when you're a younger child, those cognitions are still in the process of developing. Your decision making skills are also developing, and you're also learning how to negotiate social relationships, right? So keep in mind that children begin to interact with the world. Well, nowadays kids go to school pretty early, right? If we count like Head Start or like preschools, but children begin to navigate social world around age 4 or 5, and it takes kind of a while before they kind of understand um, how does it work socially, right? How do I develop relationships? How do I connect across genders? So those are skills that you develop, the same with cognitive and emotional skills that we continue to develop as we age. So with confidentiality, we have to be careful, right? Oh, obviously we want to honor. It is the cornerstone of our therapeutic relationship, and we want to honor confidentiality to our clients. It doesn't matter if they're younger or if they're older, right? So I think something that helps me is to be very clear from the beginning of what are your boundaries in terms of confidentiality. What is your function, and what is the extent of what you can do when a child or a younger adolescent reveals information that you think might be harmful. Obviously, we have some ethical and legal guidelines that are kind of very circumscribed and limited. It basically says that we should not promise confidentiality, and we should be open with our clients about that when there is a suspicion of harm to self, harm to other, or abuse or neglect to a child. However, in my experience, there are other thorny issues that I think are kind of complex, and is where I think we need to kind of address it a little bit, right? And it's when you have a 10-year-old, an 11-year-old, for example, who wants to engage in sexual intercourse or wants to begin using substances to kind of experiment, or is in the process of exploring their sexual identity. um, Even though you as a social worker might have a specific view about it, and you might be all up for it, what I said in the beginning, children live within specific family structures. um, And you have to be very careful with that, right? Because if a very young child is engaging in or is thinking of engaging in sexual intercourse, and because the law or because our ethical guidelines do not say anything about that, what should I do, right? Should I have the conversation with the parent? Should I not a punitive or a judgmental conversation? Should I just take the risk and let the child know that it is important for the parent and the family to be involved in this decision making process because of the health concerns involved in it, the emotional concerns? Or should I just stay quiet and honor my confidentiality? I don't think there is a right or wrong answer. I've had colleagues that are on um, one end on the spectrum, the other end in the middle. I'm kind of sort of in the middle, right? And I'll be very blunt and honest with you. Sometimes, if I know, for example, because I've learned from speaking with the family members, from the social history we collected, let's say this is a family with very strict religious views, or a family with a very traditional view of gender roles. um, I don't necessarily want to replicate the same patterns, right? I do want to be honest and transparent with the child, and I want to explain the child why I think it is important to have that conversation, right? If a 10-year old, an 11-year old is telling me, I want to have sex with my boyfriend, my girlfriend, um, I want to be able for them to, if it is going to happen, in the end, I want to be able to make the best possible decision. And I want everyone involved in the child's life, obviously with certain caveats. If we know this is a stable family, if we know this is a family that we can have this conversation with, then we should by all means have it. But what I'm saying is, you're not going to do it behind the child's back. You're going to consult with the child. You're going to explain to them the rationale, and you're going to ask them their permission of how you think this should be done, right? Do they need a couple of days to think about it? Do they want you to be present when you talk about this? Do they want them for you to do it alone? But I don't think we also have to respect the families in which our children are raised. And if we want to start breaching out these uncomfortable conversations, we got to start getting uncomfortable, right? It is going to be uncomfortable. Some parents, even when you talk with them, they're not going to like the idea. But this is part of the process, right? It's part of the process of helping children and parents and adolescents have this kind of conversation. And because you have that power, that you're a third party and you are sort of like an objective person, you can guide that conversation. So I'm not going to tell you what you should do. I'm just kind of opening the discussion of where confidentiality gets a little bit more uncomfortable and difficult, because it's not something that it's written, I don't think, in any guideline, right? In any ethical guideline, in any legal manual. So sometimes we got to make decisions based on our judgment, based on our values, based on the family and the child and adolescent that we have in front of us. Um, so keep that in mind, because I think that it's gonna reassure you, and I know that it is okay if you made a mistake, if at one point you decide to maybe have that discussion with the family, it didn't turn out the way you desired. It's a learning experience for you, and maybe you can learn how to do it different in another way. But don't be shy. If you think suicidal behaviors are not the only risky behaviors adolescents engage in. There are other risky behaviors that adolescents and younger children engage in. And I think if we want to have to start healthy communication between parents and children, we should look for ways in which we respect the self-determination and autonomy of our child and adolescent, but also helping them move along. Why don't we at least give it a try and see what happens? Obviously, you're not going to do this if there is a history, for example, physical abuse or some type of emotional abuse in the family. You also want to assess the type of family that you're working with before you make that decision. That's all that I wanted to kind of touch upon confidentiality, and then I think it was very thorough in the PowerPoint, and I think I provide you a couple of videos that you can see how a clinician interacts with a child in terms of that initial couple of first interviews. I think all I'm gonna say is that, you know, with children and adolescents, something that I've learned is always be inclusive with the family members and other important members in their life. Do not replicate the same things they are doing, the same patterns of miscommunication, of mistreatment. It is uncomfortable, but that's your work, right? Um, if you have a parent signing a form, have a child sign that form. If you tell something to a parent, also tell the same thing to the child and adolescent in a language that is appropriate for them. But do not go behind their backs and meet separately. Sometimes it's okay to meet separately, but I always suggest to meet together at the end, particularly in those initial sessions. You don't want to create the same dynamics of we're separated, we cannot talk to each other, we have poor communication, which is very common among parents and children. So you want to make sure, because you are not only building rapport with a client, you're building rapport with their family members. You want the parents on board because you want things to change for this child. A lot of the times we ask our kids and adolescents to make behavioral modifications. If we only do it with them and we don't include family members, we don't include school personnel, we're setting that kid for frustration, right? Because this kid might start engaging in change, but because you're not having this kind of conversations with other people that are important in the kid's life, you're not going to see any change, right? And it's going to set a tone of frustration for the kid. So I always encourage you, even if it is uncomfortable, even if you have a difficult parent, try to listen to them. And at the end, it might not be the case. Just take this with a grain of salt. Sometimes it's not that if you're seeing they're having a lot of trouble communicating, then at the beginning it might be best to just meet them separately. But your job is to reunite and to rekindle that communication and to improve family relationships, especially when you're working with kids and adolescents. So I encourage you to get over that initial fear. And I think in the first two discussion board posts, I kind of ask you about your challenges, your fears, what kind of might intimidate you if you have not yet conducted work with children and families. And as I see your discussions and your answers, I'll provide additional information. I'm going to do a separate video answering a couple of other questions related to interview, because I think it's getting a little bit too long, this videos. Sorry about that. So I'll make sure to film that one, and so that you can watch it, and it's going to be related to what can I do initially. I have a video on trauma. I think it's on session 4, trauma and play therapy, and I think it's going to give you an idea of how a clinician might interact to get information when we're talking about difficult topics. So all I'm going to do is give you some kind of like initial pointers of how can you guide the discussion with a child and adolescent. So yeah, I'll see you very soon. Bye bye.